Jó napot kívánok, nem tudok magyarul, and that now has exhausted the year I spent in Hungary and my ability to learn Hungarian. It's gone very dark. This is really just a jazz thing that sometimes might relate to what I'm going to talk about. It may not. I also thought it was going to be a real issue about me being in the first panel, but I think what I'm going to say follows on from the first paper, because I'm going to do a kind of historical case study of the limits and possibilities of universalizing social citizenship. Okay? So I want to really thank the organizers for inviting me to this important event. The continued relevance of the Marxist canon globally is worth celebrating in this anniversary year. 2018 is very different from the 150th anniversary in 1968, but as the last paper showed, I think we can think about some of the issues around the conjunctions. I can't help noticing, however, that most of the events are focused on the advanced capitalist world, to the neglect of the global south, and what, in the spirit of Spivak's tactical essentialism, I want to call the global east, which we remain. I did take part in a similar event in Marx's birthplace of Trier, allowing me the chance to visit the Karl Marx house, which was already referred to by one of the heads of the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung. As he said, the Karl Marx house, in its current incarnation as a museum, is administrated by FES, and therefore any of you who wanted to go to visit that in search of the revolutionary Marx would find him buried or critiqued within a social democratic Weltanschauung, at times bordering on propaganda. All right? Okay, notwithstanding Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung's role in this event, I think the focus on Central and Eastern Europe here is extremely valuable. It allows us to look at historical materialism and its importance 30 years after events across our region were meant to usher in the end of history. The invitation to speak here came at just the right moment in my own academic work. I have begun a sabbatical mainly focusing on historical and archival work on the role of socialist Yugoslavia within the non-aligned movement, a forgotten movement of profound historical importance in terms of internationalism, as well as, and this will be my main focus today, trying to make sense of social welfare in socialist Yugoslavia. So what I want to do is perhaps talk about some of the less well-known aspects of Yugoslavia's exceptionalism amongst European socialist states in the 45 years after the end of the Second World War. One of the questions I'm posing really is, how far might Marxist understandings of welfare contribute to the analysis of the Yugoslav socialist state based, at least formally, on Marxist-Leninism and on the dictatorship of the proletariat based on an alliance of the working class and other working people, as the 1958 programme of the League of Communists put it. If you just want to go to the second slide. Of course, Yugoslavia was dominated in the 60s by market socialism. There is an exhibition currently in Zagreb on the 1960s. This is a fashion show in Zagreb in 1965, and you see how the model on the catwalk obscures Lenin, but Marx and Tito are still visible. And I think that's a kind of metaphor for some of the things that I want to discuss. We can go on, and then if you press the first one, here we go. Okay. In this context then, many of the Marxist and neo-Marxist critiques of the political economy of the welfare state under advanced capitalism, we used to like to call it late capitalism, but now it's getting very late, with which I grew up in Thatcherite Britain in the 1980s, are perhaps not of immediate analytical value. Although a simplification, we were generally trying to understand welfare as a compromise between capitalism and capitalist class. On the one side, the capitalist state, whether conceived a la Polantzas, or if you were really less cool and a bit too British, by Ralph Miliband, and the working class. So that triangle of the capitalist class, capitalist state, and the working class. Of course, we forgot that the working class was not the working class, it was the organised male, white, industrial, trade unionised working class, mainly. This was not a million miles from Bismarck's idea that welfare was needed to produce healthy soldiers and stop the working class from revolting. Okay? Now there is some work, I think, by Klaus Offer and Ian Goff from that period, which is quite interesting. Goff was heavily influenced by James O'Connor's book, The Fiscal Crisis of the State, published in 1973. And via O'Connor, Goff identified three functions. Okay, this was this moment of deterministic Marxism that was very functionalist, all right? But the three functions of welfare under capitalism, Goff argued, were accumulation, reproduction, and legitimation stroke repression. He obviously hadn't read HAUSER, who would distinguish between legitimation and repression as separate elements. But perhaps with some adaptation, I would suggest, all could be relevant to trying to understand Socialist Yugoslavia's attempts at market socialism. We were convinced that social relations of welfare based on human need were only possible under socialism. And my good friend and colleague Bob Deacon, who died last year, sadly, in his book, Social Policy and Socialism, and Bob was already in the 80s working in Poland and Hungary, working with colleagues like Zsuzsa Fergén. He surveyed social welfare in the many actually existing socialist countries and found them largely failing his tests of popular democratic control, the erosion of divisions between service users and welfare professionals, and insufficiently transformative in terms of the relations between the public and the private spheres. A more utopian vision of explicitly communist welfare required, he suggested, 5 transformations. The withering away of the state didn't happen anywhere in our region. A central focus on human need, perhaps. The abolition of the law of value and commodity production. Okay. Overcoming the existing division of labour, and the abolition of the gendered division of labour and transformation of families and households. This last one, of course, hinted at the need to move away from deterministic, economistic Marxist theory to a more nuanced Marxist feminism, addressing the complex, contested and contradictory relations between welfare, households and paid and unpaid work, the relationship between the sphere of production and the sphere of reproduction. My own work at the time added race and racism to class and gender as crucial to any radical critique of the welfare states. So it's this ambivalent, traumatic baggage from Marxist theory during Thatcherite Britain that I bring with me and try to break free of as I explore the Yugoslav socialist welfare state. Okay, thanks. Some elements of Yugoslav socialist exceptionalism, of course, are well known. The state itself emerged from the victory of the partisans in an armed struggle during the Second World War, and therefore was not imposed on an unwilling population. Tito's historic no to Stalin in 1948 led to the doctrine of self-management, self-managed socialism from 1950 onwards. Yugoslav exceptionalism then rested on a specific idea of market socialism, varying at different times, and certainly from the 60s, explicitly linked to consumerism, and also from the early 60s, its founding role in the non-aligned movement. The 1974 Yugoslav constitution, following 6 or 7 years of the most intense protests across the country, set in place a highly decentralized federal structure meant to promote brotherhood and unity between recognized national groups and constitutive peoples. Many ideologues of the period referred explicitly to self-management, this federal constitution and brotherhood and unity, and non-alignment as the 3 fundamental pillars on which Yugoslav socialism was built. Now, neither a rather sterile Trotskyist debate about whether socialist Yugoslavia was a kind of state monopoly capitalism, nor the fact that between 45 and 48 some of its practices were more Stalinist than Stalin are particularly relevant here. Although the contradictions and tensions within the Communist Party itself and in relation to opposition from within and without, is an important and highly complex question. Instead of delving into that pit, I want to argue that it was the nature and form of the socialist Yugoslav welfare system that constituted the fourth element of exceptionalism. It's not easy to answer the question to what extent Marxism was important in the development of the Yugoslav socialist welfare state. There's no single answer. You'd have to look at the impact in different conjunctures as welfare settlements changed alongside the broader economic, political and social context. What is beyond question, however, is that socialist Yugoslavia had, almost throughout its entire existence, a deep commitment to a social welfare state. Parts of socialist Yugoslavia, previously within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, already had a Bismarckian-type insurance system. This was extended and expanded, and a basic safety net of social protection was put in place to smooth the path to rather rapid urbanization and industrialization. The Yugoslav welfare state included social housing, giving the workers tenants rights over expropriated property and, more importantly, newly built apartments. It began and largely remained, however, a dual system of welfare. Social rights for the new industrial workers far exceeded those of the peasants and the farmers in the rural area. Within this burgeoning welfare settlement, the issue of gender equality and women's relationship to work and welfare is particularly important, in part because of the role of women in the partisans movement and the continued existence of the self-organised anti-fascist front of women, Anti-Faschistische Front of Vienna, until its dissolution in 1953, meant that the early years of Yugoslav socialism were marked by a legal system, formally speaking, based on equality for women and against any form of gender discrimination, reflecting what Mariana Stojcic has recently termed a radical revolutionary position in relation to class, gender and national inequality. Of course, this was very much a workerist equality. Largely, although not exclusively, women's participation in higher education was also encouraged. It was largely confined to labour rights. Women were seen as an integral part of the proletariat. After the dissolution of the STRG in 1953, there was a kind of suppression of both women's formal political participation and, in the context of economic prosperity and burgeoning consumerism, the women's question as part of the class question was judged to have been solved. The 50s and 60s saw an oscillation between a focus on emancipation and a kind of gender essentialism, with women's dual burden as workers in the factory and in the home never questioned. The 70s and 80s saw a rise of new women's self-organisation in the sphere of civil society and around issues such as domestic violence and the survival of patriarchal roles. Not unlike the praxis philosophers, although on the whole ignored by them, new feminist scholars and activists developed a progressive leftist critique of Yugoslav socialism. So, although a classic state-planned, centralised socialist economy until 1948, socialist Yugoslavia later combined central and local state planning, becoming more and more decentralised over time, with the use of market mechanisms and the direct management of public property assigned to the workforce of enterprises as early as 1950. Property belonged to the people. Workers were, to quote one economist of the period, a better representative of society and a better defender of its interests than the state. Worker self-management evolved over time, more or less compatible with collective ownership of the means of production in the form of social property, and never, of course, eroding completely the planning function of the state. Now, it's interesting to contrast ideologues within the Communist Party with left-leaning sociologists of the period, who were doing surveys suggesting that there was a growing concern from workers about political interference in the self-management system and the reproduction of a cadre of not always competent managerial and political elites. A key role at local level was played by what were termed self-managed communities of interest, samoupravlenie interesnej zájemnice, CSOVI, that clearly varied across time and space, but at least in the field of social protection, allowed for the possibility of innovative welfare from below. And there is some historical research, notably by Sandra Kapelner, which has shown how groups of welfare users, together with local women's activists, were able to use the freedom in these self-managed communities of interest to fashion new approaches to issues around the reconciliation of work and care, for example. I don't know whether I've got time for this. There's a little side issue here about what on earth was going on in Yugoslav market socialism. Milica Uvelic, from an anti-Marxist position, has recently argued that market mechanisms were overridden whenever issues of income and capital were concerned. Labour had lost its commodity character, so there should be little or no income inequality, other than that related to the success or otherwise of units of production. So if you were more profitable, your salaries were higher. There's also Cardelia's attempt to rework Marx's idea of live current labour and past embodied labour, but all this actually did was meant that the older you got, the more likely your salaries would increase. Joanna Borkman, in a very interesting book looking at Yugoslavia and Hungary, has also discussed at length the attraction of neoclassical economic theory for an emerging epistemic community of Yugoslav economists who saw neoclassical mathematical modelling, and in particular price theory, as highly relevant for Yugoslav market socialism. Now, crucially, in the early 1980s, there was a recognition that 1960s, a redistributive welfare state was not enough. Social problems were not going to wither away under socialist conditions. There was concern, even a panic, about the rise of juvenile offending in big cities. Training of social workers, predominantly women, originally in high schools and later at universities, began in the 1960s, alongside the establishment in every municipality of a centre for social work, staffed by a multidisciplinary team, tasked with administering social welfare, but also undertaking direct work with those who fell outside of the scope of productive relations. Now, authors such as myself and Ray Maglajlic, as well as Daria Završek, have noted the curriculum for the training of these social workers was a strange mixture of United States casework theory, Scandinavian psychosocial work, and Austrian psychology, with textbooks basically reflecting this, but in footnotes, adding a Marxist tinge with some quotes from Cardelia or Marx or Lenin. Most of the thinking behind centres for social work was top-down, although associations of citizens continued to emerge and also introduced radical practices. In a recent book, I think it's there, yeah, it's on the bottom there, with Rory Archer and Igor Duda, we argue that despite the nominally privileged position of the working class and principles of Marxist-Leninism, social stratification and inequality remained a rather permanent feature of Yugoslav socialism, both within and crucially between the constituent republics. If you had a table looking at the relative wealth of, let's say, Kosovo compared to Slovenia, it didn't change much between 1945 and 1989. If anything, it got worse. Okay? Also, those who did not fit into the productivist models, the unemployed, and we speak in a place where unemployment has now been rendered illegal. Unemployment. A large group of hidden unemployed, the Roma, the homeless, or housing deprived, and now we speak in a place where homelessness has been declared illegal. Deviants and so on were subject to a range of biopolitical and disciplinary practices, reminding me that I should have said that welfare analysis needs Foucault as much as it needs Marx. Now, ongoing work by Siniša Zrinjak and myself on welfare retrenchment during the deep economic crisis of the 1980s suggests that socialist Yugoslavia very much followed Latin America in terms of IMF-led adjustment programs, standby arrangements, that saw cutbacks in many areas of welfare. It brought back urban poverty for the first time since the Second World War. Branko Milanovic's PhD thesis was looking at urban poverty in Belgrade, and it reinforced an argument that an extensive welfare state was not affordable in times of economic recession, linked to all that work going on here about premature welfare states and so on. Overall, then, judgments that the socialist welfare state in socialist Yugoslavia was too egalitarian. There is a bunch of sociologists in Croatia doing empirical work on the problem with our transition to neoliberal capitalism is that we hold on to an egalitarian syndrome. We're too attached to the wrong kind of equality. Any idea that it was too egalitarian and too paternalistic are oversimplified. The nature of the welfare assemblage varied from republic to republic. It varied from period to period. One of the lessons from studying the 1980s is as the Yugoslav welfare state became more paternalistic and controlling, within the confines of IMF-induced global capitalist disciplinarity, it also became less egalitarian. The period reminds us that Yugoslav historiography needs to refocus not only on elites and the working class, but also on the treatment of surplus and marginal populations in crisis conditions. And of course, Marx's own concepts of the lumpen proletariat don't help really a great deal here. If we're going to account for the breakup of Yugoslavia in terms of to go beyond ethno-national frames of understanding. Click again. And I'm coming to a conclusion. In the post-socialist, post-Yugoslav space, socialist welfare arrangements have been thoroughly undermined and replaced by uneven, hybrid, highly residualized, and increasingly punitive forms of welfare. We have truly joined Europe. Right? Complex reconfigurations have occurred in conflict and post-conflict conditions, in which changing relationships between the formal and the informal, the public and the private, state and non-state actors, coexist with diaspora, migrant, cross-border, and enclave claims and entitlements. New assemblages of welfare are emerging, marked by multiple and asymmetric citizenship rights, reproducing but never reducible to class, gender, ethnicity, age, disability, sexuality, and geographical location. The anthropologist Azra Romajic has described the semi-absence of both the family and the state in post-war Bosnia-Herzegovina, inducing a crisis of care in which mere survival and the reproduction of the self and the management of intimate relationships of kin is an increasingly constant, never-ending struggle. In her studies of mothers of children with disability, again in Bosnia, Shana Berkovic argues the ambiguous ground of social protection is experienced as erratic, unpredictable, and mysterious. You need great flexibility to mobilize whatever resources you can, including informal contexts, just to get a fraction of what you need. Welfare users in both Romajic and Berkovic's study invoke the lost logic of a socialist welfare system in which welfare was a right and a duty of the state in the face of the realities of a system which is now limited, discretionary, and largely lacking in compassion. So I'm not saying that the Yugoslav socialist welfare system was revolutionary. It was absolutely not transformative in terms of contributing to the continual development of socialism, but it was at least about the universalizing of rights. Okay? It was not about new layerings of welfare, new regimes of blame, and recalibrations of what Andrea Mullerbach has termed moral citizenship. Okay, just one more paragraph concluding, if I may. Just to conclude very briefly with three lessons, both from Marxist theory and from the lessons from Yugoslav socialist welfare. The first is, whether we're talking about capitalism or socialism, tying welfare too narrowly to productivism is a real problem. I think this opens up for me, and we can come back to it in discussion if you like, issues around the importance of a social commons, issues around the work we're trying to do in Zagreb around new municipal kind of socialism, and the importance of linking care and support of people outside of productive relations to care and support of the planet, a finite planet, which Marx, of course, also didn't really address. Defending services against commodification is never enough. We must address the contradictions of the state, even within socialism. and work in and against the state. We also need to go beyond methodological nationalism and welfare or socialism in one country and address what Noemi Lenvai and I have termed variegated capitalist relations and the complex connections between welfare in the core, welfare in the semi-periphery, and welfare in the periphery, whilst always holding these terms as both relational and contingent and not essentialist. We've written about the authoritarian neoliberalism tendencies in both Hungary and Croatia. Finally, another social welfare, prefigurative and transformative, is only possible through deep politicization and activism from below, connecting with what Nancy Fraser would call a politics of recognition, redistribution, and rights from above. Forgive me for wondering what old Carl would think of this. Thank you.